Crosses painted on Prague's Old Town Square represent the more than 25,000 people who have died from COVID-19 here. Their loved ones come to grieve. My brother was supposed to be vaccinated and did not live to see it, says Anna Vodichova. COVID chewed him up. The Czech Republic, like many countries in Eastern Europe,
Okay, so we're ready to start. I apologize for being a few minutes late, a few techie problems here. So I'd like to call this meeting to order. And we'll go right to 2.1. We need a mover and a seconder for that the minutes of the Committee of the Whole meeting held on March 16th, 2021 be adopted. Okay, that was, I think, Christopher Center Netchard. Any errors or omissions? Am I hearing a voice? Okay. Any errors or omissions? Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? None? Carried. And you were in favor?
I'm in favor, yeah, just scrambling to find my hands.
We'll go right to new business, 3.1, the 2021 citizen budget. Mr. Anderson, that's you, you're on.
Oh. Thank you, Mayor and Council. This is the 2021 citizen budget report, going through some of the survey results. As mentioned in our January meeting, it's a requirement under the community charter to seek public consultation. Normally that's done through a open house type format to get public input. In the past we have used surveys and public open houses. We've used this survey tool in the prior 2 years, prior to 2021. The cost of the tool is $2,850. That was what was required to do the 2021 survey this year. The process that we went through, we reviewed a number of different templates that were available. We had copies of other surveys that are done in BC and across Canada. reviewed those with council and management, and then put that out as a survey for a 10-day period at the end of February 22nd to March 3rd. We heavily promoted that through the different social media channels to get public input. The process for doing the survey, you were able to go into the survey product and enter as a guest or as a logged in user. The benefit of logging in was the fact that you could go in there and provide some comments, and in the report here we've got the comments, all of the ones that were received through the process. And then you could go back in again, and similar to Facebook, you could reply to your comments or reply to other comments in the system as well. The survey had a number of sections, and looking back on how the survey went this year, we may, if we use the same tool next year, trim it down a little bit. There were a number of areas where we asked for information. At the start of it, you had the property tax information. So you put in your assessed value based on your BC assessment notice that you'd received, and it would provide a breakdown based on the 2021 preliminary budget of where your dollars were being spent. Now, those are the dollars for municipal tax revenue. They are not the dollars for all of the other taxing bodies. One of the comments was that it was fairly light, but if you did hover over the pie, it would actually show the numbers and percentages. So the property tax section, there was a service budget section there. So for all of the different categories or segments of the budget, whether it's general government or public works, transit, and so forth, you had the ability to say that barring inflation and any other sort of non-discretionary type increases to the budget, would you like to see the budget the same in 2021? Would you like to potentially see it higher or lower? So you had that option going through all of the different groupings there. And we'll get into the results of that voting. On page 3 of the report, we've got the comments that were received. Some good suggestions throughout the different areas, even though there weren't a lot of responses. There was some focus on roads and infrastructure for sure. There was a few that responded on bylaws and RCMP. I'm not sure if anyone wants to comment. We'll go through the report and we can get into the questions after that. The funds allocation section, so based on a hypothetical $1,000 in your pocket, where would you like to see the money be spent? I mean, is it into capital projects? Would it be operating initiatives, strategic initiatives that the city has? So we broke that down into a number of categories and allowed people to take that $1,000 and spend it where they wanted to. We tracked a little bit of information on demographics, so where were the people responding from? It was a fairly good split between, you know, those that resided on the bench and city center and Diamondvale and Collettville, so it wasn't heavily weighted to one area in particular. Almost half the respondents were over the age of 50. There were more female respondents than male. The 53% have lived in Merritt for over 20 years, and about 28% had only been here for less than 5. So it was good that we got a bit of a mix there. Some newcomers and some that have been here for 20 years. The results of the survey. So to get into that, and this is a sort of summarized based on the report, so there's the report that backs this up, but to summarize the different areas where they would like to spend their $1,000. So broken it into the percentage of respondents that said something other than 0 in that category, and then based on the average of all the respondents, what did they actually want us to spend for those areas. And we did have, you know, roads and infrastructure is pretty broad. It's not necessarily just roads. It could be water systems, it could be sewer systems. So, you know, future surveys, we may want to look at breaking that down a bit. But for roads and infrastructure, that was by far the highest ranked one, with 86% of the respondents saying definitely spend something there. And the average of the spend was $257. So that was at the top of the list. Downtown revitalization, 69% wanted something other than 0 to be spent on that, and averaged out to $206. On the other extreme, the bottom of the list, we had airport expansion, and that was only about 18% of them respondents said to spend more than zero on that, so very low on the ranking, as was parkland acquisition and attracting light industries and business. Now, when you look at the results of the funding allocation here, I mean, the top three are pretty visible. I mean, those are things that you drive on, places that you go, and, you know, sidewalks that you walk on. So, I mean, those things people can touch and feel and see, and those were ranked fairly high. The bottom three, I would say, are maybe there's some requirement for some information on what the benefits are of attracting light industries or business, or information on, does the city have a lot of parkland? Do we need to acquire parkland? And things like airport expansion, what does that mean economically? Is there a big benefit? Is there a requirement? Would that be of value to the city? So those things, maybe it's just lack of information that people don't want to spend the money on those. So that's the funding allocation piece. On the service budget results, so this is where, for the different categories of what the city provides in the way of services, whether you would want to see higher funding, lower funding, the same funding. So what is your first choice, and then basically those that had voted it as the second choice. So for example, RCMP and community policing, the top selection percentage-wise was keep it the same, and then other than that it was higher. So there were more that voted higher than lower. So you can see that there are some that relate to sort of safety, to roads. Those ones were the same or higher. Public works, roads was higher or the same. There were three categories there that had lower as the second choice. So none of them had lower as the first choice. Nobody said, cut the budget there, let's see less spending in that area. But there were three that stood out as having lower as a clearly second choice, and that was bylaw and inspection, transit services, and planning and development services. And from my perception of the results there, that these are areas that you would expect to see increased expenses with growth in population and development. So if the city was growing and development was increasing, those are places that we would probably see more expenditure than less. The participation on the survey, we had 76 participants out of the 231 unique visitors to the site. So that was a 33% completion rate as far as the survey goes, which according to the survey company was fairly high relative to other communities that have the same survey in place. So even though we didn't get the numbers that we wanted, the participation rates were pretty good. So just a wrap up on some of the results there. So with the roads sort of coming out as one of the top things on the survey, the 2021 capital plan, as we know, includes the Vote Street Phase 2, $7.5 million project that is subject to grant funding. If there is no Vote Street improvement for 2021 due to grant, or not receiving a grant fund, we have $250,000 in the budget that would be allocated to asphalt replacement throughout town. On a regular basis, we spend money on patching, on potholes, on boulevard grading, on alley grading. In the 2021 capital, we've got the Armstrong Design project, which would make that a shelf-ready project for 2022. And we are also planning the Parker Drive as the next project over and above the Armstrong one, which would be sort of 2022 planning. So those are things that are ongoing on the roads, on the roadside there. Some just general lessons around the process here, some things that we may do differently if we use the survey. We probably would want to do the intake period a little bit longer. We only did 10 days for this go round, so I think for future ones we'd want to do 14 to 21 days. Probably fewer sections in the survey, so keep it a little simpler, maybe not as broad as far as the different sections go. And then expand on some of the fund allocation categories. So if we use something like the fund allocation again, let's take the roads, parks, and infrastructure, and let's break that down into roads, into parks, into sewer, into water, and those sort of things. So we get a little bit more granular on the feedback there. And then things like recreation programs and facilities, that's fairly broad as well too. Is it more programs that people want? Is it more arena openings, or do they want more improvements to the aquatic center and those sort of things? So take the information a little bit further while balancing, the simplicity. We don't want to make it too difficult, but we also want to get the information that's useful out of these surveys. So that's a bit of a wrap up on it. And I'll open it up to questions.
Anybody have questions for Mr. Anderson? I was going to say, I see one of the comments from the citizen budget program, I think itself, is that he saw us having a highly engaged community and content was generally seen to be accessible and friendly.
Yeah,
So that's a plus for our community. Any other comments or questions for Wayne?
I just want to, what is, increased, I'll have to get back in here, I actually.
Was it the residential, or was it the residential attraction one?
Yeah, residential
Yeah.
attraction.
Yeah, the increased residential attraction was, do you want the city to spend more money promoting Merritt as a destination for new residents? So do we want the Economic Development Department or others to be promoting Merritt as a destination for whether it be retirees or people looking to move outside of the larger cities?
Okay, thanks.
Anybody else have any questions for Mr. Anderson? Okay, well, we don't even have to move or bring this in. So it's open to chat if you, if you choose. Otherwise, we'll move on to the procedure bylaw, 3.2. I don't see any takers, Wayne, so thank you very much
Okay.
for your presentation.
Thank you.
And we'll move to 3.2, procedure bylaw, and Mr. Lois, are you ready for that?
Always ready, your worship. Is that, my voice?
Do you want the clicker?
Such a procedural joke.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Your Worship. So, as you are all extremely aware, we've now passed a new procedure bylaw in the city. And as part of that, you requested a training session in our committee of the whole on how to use various parts of it or some of the key changes that had happened. I think Mr. Smith has kindly printed you all out a copy of the new version that you have in front of you. I have so many different versions hanging around, it's not even funny, but I'll try to make sure I'm using the right one. So, next. There we go. If you're just looking at it overall, I would say by far and away the biggest changes, are these the biggest changes? This was certainly what I thought was the biggest changes when I was putting this PowerPoint together. So we've formalized some of the systems with the webcasting and the online meetings. We've standardized the rules between committees and council a lot more than they used to be. We've clarified the meeting calendar, so hopefully that is going to just be a lot better for everyone. One of the things that we did discover from residents with the old bylaw is that the way it was worded, there were several sections that it referred to things. Because it referred to one thing, people didn't realize that other things would also be possible. So, for example, there was a comment from residents about how the old bylaw talked about calling special meetings and how that could be done for closed session items. The community charter doesn't say that you can't call special meetings for non-closed sessions, but because it explicitly referenced that, it made people think that you could only do it to have closed sessions. So that was the sort of thing that we were trying to get out, kind of cleaning up all the language, making it a lot more obvious what was and wasn't permissible, and explicitly stating some things which hadn't been in there before. And there were some things, for example, I don't think webcasting was mentioned in there at all. Online meetings were only included as an add-on a few years ago. There was a proposal to change things about a year ago when COVID started, again to do a tack-on, but that ultimately became part of this overall thing. So,
Can I interrupt for a sec?
Please do.
Do we know what the future of electronic meetings are going to be? Right now, we're still under a PHO kind of directive that allows us to have electronic meetings.
yes, Your Worship. So we're still holding meetings under what's called Ministerial Order M192. That basically it says that, well, as it's been amended by the Public Health Order on gatherings and events, which was most recently updated on March 24th this year. We're waiting to see if there's an update from Dr. Henry's announcement yesterday. That makes it permissible for you all to meet in the chamber, although they do still recommend that people meet online. The public are not allowed under provincial law to be in the chamber, and they, ultimately, the province recommend, frankly, that we don't do what we're doing here, but I know that you all found it much more productive to be in the same place with COVID precautions in place. But I think...
And we are maximum 10 people allowed to be in this room, is that?
That's one of the things that gets a little convoluted. I think Dr. Henry was saying don't meet up with more than 10 people at a time, but it wasn't entirely clear how it applies to workplaces. So.
Okay.
But yes, and I think earlier in the pandemic, this room was rated at 20 people. We're typically not loading it past about 13 at the moment. So, and I think there are 10 people here tonight. So. But yeah, so electronic meetings are, if anything, more likely to come back more strongly than they are at the moment. But we'll hopefully in the near future we'll be able to return to relative normality. So I'm just trying to resize this on the screen. So online meetings, yep, one of the things in here. So it had been an add-on in the old one. It's actually right at the end. It was electronic participation, which allowed people to attend in a couple of ways, but...
it was mainly just committees, wasn't it?
Very much so, yeah. So the new one, we integrated online meetings much more substantially. So this, obviously, this was with current events very much at the front of our minds, although it does apply going forward if it's just more convenient, or if, say, natural disasters, say there's a flooding or a fire, it means you'll still be able to continue meeting. So some of the new rules on here, we've got a reverse onus on votes. So the community charter, one of the section 123, one of the rules they have on voting, which we'll get into later, is that if a member does not vote, they are deemed to have voted in favor. So on the online meetings, cognizant of connection quality issues, there's the new rule in here that the chair of the committee or the mayor chairing council will only call for those who are opposed to an item, and anyone who doesn't speak up at that point is deemed to have voted in favor. We also put a rule in that if the connection quality of a single of any member is inadequate to allow them to participate, that the meeting can declare them to not actually be present. So at that point, we would declare that they had left the meeting. Frankly, the in-person equivalent would be suddenly falling unconscious or something. One of the things that we do want to emphasize, because it's difficult to know what's happening when you're not all in the same place. If there's a closed meeting in this chamber, then it's super easy. The cameras are off, the door's closed, we know exactly who's in the room and who's able to know what's going on. If there's an online meeting which is a closed session, then you are all personally responsible for ensuring the integrity of that closed session and that other people are not there. Because we're required to note everyone who attends a closed session of council. So if you're sitting at your desk in your kitchen and say your partner or your kid wanders past, technically we're supposed to record that. So please make sure if you're in a closed session that you're very aware that you are the only person near your computer and who knows what's going on. And that's, again, part of a security thing. It's a safety thing. It makes sure that you can't be accused of leaking information. That if something gets out of closed session, then we need to figure out kind of how it happened. So the onus is on every single member who's attending virtually to make sure that that is kept. So yes, more specifically about closed meetings, one of the things that I personally, it makes my skin crawl every time this comes up just because it's a completely understandable mistake, but I want to be absolutely super clear, and I've said this before, I'll say it again as many times as is needed. You right now are not in a closed meeting. It's true the public are not allowed to physically be here. They can't be in this chamber, but they are watching online. I can actually tell you there's about half a dozen people watching you right now. So just because there aren't people physically here doesn't mean it's a closed meeting. A closed meeting is governed under the Community Charter, Section 90. And that's where you've voted that because of the things that'll be discussed, other people aren't allowed to know what's going on. So one of the rules that we put in place in the new bylaw, it specifies that if you've been discussing something that you thought needed to be confidential, so you entered closed session, and then after discussing it a bit, you realize actually it doesn't need to be, it emphasizes that you can return to open session, so resume the recording so that have the discussion in open session. That's if you wanted to. So yeah, closed meetings and Order M192 meetings, very different. I do understand why the public feel they want to be here in person, but whenever they say, you're in a closed meeting, no, it's actually still an open meeting. Thinking of specific meetings, the annual meeting was always technically a thing. The old bylaw, I don't think, referred to it at all. The Community Charter requires you to hold an annual meeting where you consider two reports, the annual report and the development cost charges report. I think the annual report was always considered, normally within the time requirements given by law. The DCC report was not always considered. It's buried in a relatively obscure section of the Local Government Act, the requirement to do that. So we wrote it into the new Procedure Bylaw just to emphasize going forward, so hopefully it'll never be forgotten again. So the annual meeting requirements, if you comply with everything which is in this bylaw, then you're good for the Community Charter and the Local Government Act. So there's a couple of things that we wrote into here that strictly didn't need to be because they were an obligation on you anyway, but this helps make sure that all the obligations are met.
I never knew that the term annual was part of the Community Charter.
Absolutely, yep.
Thank you for catching that. And 100 other things.
If there's one thing I'm good at catching, Your Worship, it's the minutiae that nobody else cares about. So thinking about agendas, we hope that some of the changes we made just make it a lot more logical. For example, in the old committee policy, it was really weird. The committees required minimum of a week's notice of the agenda being out there, and council only required 3 days, which seemed a little odd, because you would imagine council would be discussing the super important things, but so we've now standardized everything in there. Obviously, we will aim to meet more than the minimum. We often won't, but we will do our best. And this is just obviously agenda dispatch, the actual notification that there will be a meeting. We'll always hope to have out weeks or months beforehand unless there's, for whatever reason, urgent items. And speaking of urgent items, we've tried codifying how late items are handled. The old bylaw explained that late items would be allowed, but it didn't really give much guidance or information about them. And I know that there were some situations where councillors felt that they were having things sprung on them with very short notice, very little information, and it was unclear as to why that had been added with no notification, no notice. So we put in a requirement now that the chair of the meeting and the clerk of the meeting will both be required to believe there is a degree of urgency to the matter, which hopefully will help give reassurance that if a late item is being presented, it's because it has to be presented as a late item. So now we're getting on to the fun stuff. Procedural matters and how motions are handled. When you say fun stuff, this is fun to me. So, these are detailed in sections like 14 and 15 and 16 of the bylaw that you've got in front of you. Sorry, I should emphasize as well, if you have any questions when you're going through this, do shout. So, one of the things which was always a question, well, not always a question, but was raised a couple of times, certainly in the time I've been involved with merit, and was never actually mentioned in the old bylaw, was what to do with a motion if the mover of that motion was no longer felt that it was necessary, or felt that the debate had moved on in such a way that they no longer wanted to put it forward. There are some traditions of thought that say once something has been moved and seconded, it belongs to the chamber, and only the chamber can deal with it. There are others that say if somebody no longer wishes to put their name behind it to move it, then it falls because it no longer has the leg to stand on. So we've tried to put a hybrid of those two schools of thought into this, which allows a mover to withdraw a motion with the seconder's consent. So the idea behind that is that if, say, the discussion reveals that a motion would be redundant or unnecessary, or there are other ways of dealing with something, that the meeting can move on from it cleanly without needing to take unnecessary votes, but also that just because somebody changes their mind, they can't hamstring all debate and stop other members from discussing something. So hopefully that is a good hybrid. Also, I know I mentioned when this came before council, but again, a procedure bylaw is one of the harder bylaws to modify because we have to give public notice and things, but if for whatever reason any of these rules don't work for you, if you want to change things, do remember it is your procedure bylaw. You can always propose changes, request them, vote on them. It is a bylaw of council. Council can change it. Staff recommendations. This is something which I know we sometimes feel a little awkward about when we're putting forward because there's something which needs to be discussed, but it's a pure policy decision about whether or not you want to do it. So staff feel, how should we put the recommendation forward? So again, in this, one of the new rules that we wanted to emphasize is just because staff have proposed something, all that is a technical recommendation that you can discuss it, you can move it, you're under no obligation to. If you get to an item in a report and it's been introduced, you've asked questions, and then one of you wants to move something completely different, you're always free to do that. You don't have to discuss the staff recommendation at all. You don't have to do it as the first item. I think normally you probably will, because we like to think we're putting forward recommendations with a view as to how you'll be wanting to discuss them, but you're under no obligation. Sorry, my mask is all over the place. Don't actually have it on the slide, but something you have already started using is varying the order of the agenda. And I think Mr. McEwen was particularly grateful for that at the last council meeting. Yeah. That's one of the items. Not open to debate, must be voted on immediately if you propose doing things in different order so that if you feel things make more sense to be put together or to save somebody from having to hang around for hours at a time.
Mr. Lewis, what you don't put in here is that motion has to be unanimous. Is that community charter? That's the way we've been operating. It's on 15B.
Yeah, right, that's listed under must be voted on immediately.
Yeah, it says, yeah, but it doesn't say unanimously.
I don't think there are any community charter rules on that.
It was in our previous bylaw, but there is no requirement, it's unanimous.
Not anymore.
Well, it was the same to add a late item, that too. We had, it had to be unanimous. So
That
don't-
one's still in there, Your Worship, under 11A. May be added by unanimous vote of the voting members present.
Okay,
So I think reordering can be done by majority vote now. Well, maybe we discovered the first thing that you might want to think about changing.
and Councillor Christopherson?
Yes, thanks, Your Worship. Back to 15A, to call the question.
Mhm.
I would presume that there must be some sort of decorum around that, that you, before anybody even gets into the debate, you call the question too soon, so. Is there sort of a time frame or that everybody on council has a chance to say anything? I mean, I would hate to put a motion on the floor and have somebody else call the question.
Through Your Worship to Councillor Christopherson, there's no obligation in the procedural and the procedure bylaw for there to be any particular amount of debate. I think the expectation in decorum is that if something is put forward and somebody immediately requests to call the question, that it's do 4 members of council want to immediately just move on from that and immediately vote on something. Because if they do, then that's the majority will of council. If they don't, then you would have to continue on with the debate. So obviously the chair could, if they were aware that someone was trying to use that as an abuse, then they could potentially not recognize that person to speak. But then you also get into, if there is a majority will of council who want to simply end the debate and move on, then that is the majority view in the room.
So that's,
So the majority could, the 4 people could stifle the conversation for the other 3?
okay,
I'm
Mr.
kind
Smith.
of nitpicky,
Yeah.
but I also don't want to see something like this abused.
yeah.
Well, take a look at the Teams things I just sent you, Greg, and you can answer it. But I think that part of the issue is I'm going to defer to Greg on this. I think that procedural motions typically aren't subject to debate.
No.
A procedural motion you just vote on. Is that correct?
My view is that, yeah, that's the definition of a procedural motion, that's something which is immediately considered.
Correct. So when you're looking at 15, there isn't ever a debate on a procedural motion. If somebody brings a to call the question motion, you don't ever debate the to call a question motion. But I think what your question is what happens previous. So if you understand, and I think that this is what I'm getting, you understand that you're not debating the motion to call the question, you're wondering if there is a question previously on the floor that is going to get cut short because somebody brings forward a to call the question motion. Is that correct?
Yeah, because usually this motion, call the question, is after the debate is going on and on and on, and is starting to be circular, that you try to
Right.
cut
So
to the chase, but I'm
again, the motion to call the question is not a vote on the thing itself. So if
No.
people aren't done talking, then that will presumably fail at the vote to call the question. Does that make sense? If you guys are right in the middle of conversation and somebody says, I make a motion to call the question, and everybody else is like, what are you doing? Somebody seconds it, you vote on it, only 2 people vote to call the question,
Yeah.
and 5 people don't, you keep debating.
But if 4 people did,
Yeah, if the majority is saying, I'm done, we're done talking
Ultimately-
about this, we've been round and round and round and round before, and so 4 people vote for it, then the motion, you would proceed to a vote on the motion itself.
I would say ultimately one of the things about democracy is that it's not just the rules that are written down on the paper, it's the intangible culture that also informs those rules. And to say, whilst it's absolutely true that, say, 4 members of council who wanted to decide there should never be any debate on anything could railroad everything through, but then that you would hope that that wouldn't happen. And if it does, then they do have a majority to make whatever rules they want.
And Councillor White?
Isn't it the mayor that just calls the question?
Sometimes. most of
Normally,
the time.
yes. This is only in there, so if somebody wants to say, we've been discussing for however long, it's no longer useful.
2 hours. Nobody called that question.
Okay, I get it. I got lost on that one. Thank you.
And Councillor Richard?
Much like Councillor White's question, I was just kind of thinking the same thing, because as we're debating things, are there certain motions where this would be appropriate? Could it be anything that's just going on with discussion if we find that we're going over the same issue several different ways?
And, okay. I've got another question kind of similar to both of those.
One thing to talk about, kind of why the to call a question motion exists and why councillors can make it instead of just a mayor or the chair of the meeting. Typically, you're right that is something you're going to defer to the chair on, but if it's very clear from discussion that the chair or the mayor is leaning towards a particular course of action and isn't calling the question until they know that they've filibustered those enough votes to get something through, if you go, again, around and around and around, this gives the power to council. A lot of these are, you're going to have your typical procedure, but it's to prevent kind of the abuse of a voting system or democracy, to allow somebody to say, great, here's the particular course of action. So it's a fail-safe or a safeguard. I don't anticipate that it's something where councillors are going to need to do this on a regular basis, but should the need arise because, again, you feel like you've heard the same thing from multiple councillors multiple times, preferably, I'm sure you will find that instead of doing it yourself, having a question saying, Mayor, would it be appropriate to call the question at this point is probably going to go over better for everybody involved. But it's just about creating that mechanism should it ever be needed.
And my question is, what about the call of the chair when we have a debate that we feel the full debate hasn't taken place at that point in time? Because it could work the other way. There could be three that really want to push for that fourth person. Can the question, I guess I can call the question at any time, but,
Your Worship, you can always call the question since you're chairing the meeting.
but can I stop a question
If a question's been
if
called,
a question's been called?
if the question is called, it goes to a vote on the question.
Only
on
by a
calling the
vote.
question.
Okay,
We're tiptoeing into the world of Robert's rules on this one. We're
Yes.
not all the way there, but we're tiptoeing in.
okay.
But no, as a general rule, if a lot of those votes in section 15, the votes on whether or not to have votes, or the things, that background behavior that you never normally get into. The writing is in there in order to provide the explanation of what will happen in unusual situations, which, to be honest, I mainly think about because I've been in council chambers that were having recorded votes on whether or not to have recorded votes on an item. So, some other arcane procedural minutiae that is, actually, you've used a few times even since I've been here. Deferring and referring items, I hopefully clarified when to use each of those. Deferring items, you have to specify the date. It's postponing something to the same group of people. Referring an item, you're specifying who it's going to. You're asking somebody else to take action, normally at their next meeting. And there is a note in there that select committees can only refer items to council because otherwise there was a concern that select committees, since they're potentially only a single member of council on there, they might not know the best thing to be doing. They might be trying to refer items to bodies that aren't really appropriate. So they just send it to council and then council can decide where the best place to consider an item is. And as Mr. Smith noted, some of these rules are, fail-safes, things that you won't normally be using, you might not need to. This one is fairly entirely up to you whether or not you're going to be doing things or not. Notices of motion, which I know a lot of you have a lot of experience with, and some of you don't always feel particularly comfortable about the best ways to be doing things. These were only referenced in the old one in a single paragraph as they may be introduced and council may discuss them but not make any decision until the next until the next meeting. And that was it. We've now created a fairly major new system with a new policy which you passed, which allows you to get staff assistance in creation and drafting. And the thing that I'll mention is that this is only ever intended to help you. You are under no obligation to come to us and get your ideas pre-approved. You can always just bring a motion to council. We created the system in an effort to provide support to councillors who, if you feel that there is something that you want to do, but you're not sure about the best way to do it, you can come to us in confidence and get assistance with information on things like, say, I don't know, if you are thinking about a notice of motion about public works things, but you're not familiar with the internal machinations of the department, then you can talk to the staff involved and see what the decision would have to be and what language would be required in order to get the effect that you wanted. And we would provide you with limited drafting assistance in order to specifically get across the point that you wanted made. And the hope is that this will make it easier for you to have high-quality debates where you all know exactly what is under discussion. The other requirement in there is that it be provided in writing at the time of the council meeting or immediately afterwards to me, where I will decide whether or not the written version is the version that you said out loud. Because if that's not in place, then you wind up debating what I think I've heard, which is not always what you intended to get across. So again, the hope is that this will help make it a lot easier for you to control what it is that you're actually doing. For elected members to say, this is what I want to do, how do I do it, and how do I make sure that this is accurately represented in all the documents. And so I've got some examples on screen of a less good notice of motion, and a better one. I'm not saying this is ideal. This was something I came up with at about 5:30 this evening. But say a non-specific notice of motion might be that this council be green. And a lot of people might say that would be a laudable goal, but what on earth does that mean? How are you going to accomplish it? What's the policy outcome that's going to come? And so if you came to staff and you asked for assistance, then we might discuss with you what it was you were trying to get across, and discover that there was a specific goal in mind of the one-year period, 2022 to 2023, reducing electric lighting in City Hall by 10%. And that's a very specific goal with a time frame, it's measurable. So that's the sort of way that we would be looking to help you, of taking your idea and saying, what is it that you're actually trying to do? How do we make sure that you and the other 6 elected members discuss your specific idea?
Mr. Smith.
And to go one layer deeper, even when you look at that, this is precisely why we encourage people to come in, is when you say reducing the use of electric lighting, are we talking about removing 1/10 of light bulbs from the city of Merritt? Are we talking about reducing electric consumption by 10%? And so getting to the point where you know exactly what a motion means so that we can actually do something about it is somewhat more complicated than it initially seems. So we definitely appreciate that approach.
And I think one of the things we were trying to avoid is the debate during a notice of motion. There is no debate at a notice of motion, not even from the person who is moving it. So this doesn't give you that right to do that, so I will be stopping that. It's the notice only that will be provided to council. Adam,
I
did
think
you
at
have
this-
something to say?
Sorry.
Thank you.
I have a horrible feeling, Your Worship, at this point my presentation started running out of steam. So please have them in writing. They must be in writing. If they're not in writing, you might wind up debating what I think I heard. One of the other important things, amendments.
Can I stop you at that?
So, yes, Your Worship.
If they're not in writing, my
Yes.
choice would be that they don't happen. because that's where your version isn't necessarily what the version was that was stated. And to bring a motion to us later may be different.
Yep. The policy is, yeah, that's pretty much just a page explaining how, come to us, we'll provide you with confidential assistance. So, yeah, sorry, section 35C, the member must read aloud the motion for council and provide a written copy to the clerk for use in the minutes and the agenda.
So you can't bring it after the fact. What we're saying is,
Yep.
get it to you at the time of the motion, the notice of motion.
You see, this is why we use the adopted version of the bylaw, Your Worship, because my earlier version was slightly different to this, and that's still the one in my head. So yeah, and then that goes on to reference the amendment procedure, which amendments, yeah, these things apply across the board. Notices of motion, ordinary motions, whatever it is you're doing. You can only amend something which has been moved and seconded, because up until that, it's not on the table for discussion. So you should never be trying to, if there's, say, a staff report, a staff recommendation on a report, then you don't want to be sitting there and saying, I'd like to amend this staff recommendation. You either want to move what's on the paper or move something else instead. So you can move whatever it is that you want, but until something has been moved and seconded, you're not amending things, you're simply moving. Amendments happen once something is up for discussion because it's been moved and seconded. Ideally, you would be able to plan things ahead. That's possible for, say, recommendations which will come in written form, whether that be a notice of motion or through a staff report. But if you don't, if someone makes a motion in the meeting and then you want to amend it, that's where we'll be probably looking to slow the meeting down slightly. Say, if the amendment is not available in written form, then we'll want to make sure that everyone is very clear on what is actually being voted on at any given time. We've had several meetings in the last few months where I've been frantically typing and then ultimately been able to read it back. And I think we'd like to normalize, frankly, that more, just to make sure that everyone knows what it is that they're actually voting on at any point in time. Because I don't think there's anything worse for an elected member than hands going up, hands going down, and then realizing afterwards, what was that?
And I will try to get better at slowing that process down and helping out there.
There's a new rule in here which I think is generally considered implicit, but wasn't actually in the old bylaw, so again I'm flagging it, that any amendment must not negate the substantive motion. E.g., if the motion is that we go out for cookies, you can't amend it to that we insert the word not. Because if you're going to do that, just vote against it. And then if you win, you can bring a new motion. But...
Councillor Christopherson?
Yeah, I just want a little bit more clarification on that notice of motion thing, because
Okay. Sorry, I didn't
in
see.
here, 35F is saying, no notice of motion may be debated until it's been seconded, but the intent of a notice of motion isn't putting a motion on the table, it's saying what's going to be on at the next meeting, so we don't debate notices of motion.
No.
We don't discuss them or anything, so I'm just a little bit unclear with that wording there, because we don't debate a notice of motion, we don't discuss it, we don't explain it.
This is one of those
You
weird
just make
things
it.
where you use these, sometimes use the same words to describe something at different stages when it's arguably different things. So at the meeting one, where Councillor Smith stands up and says, I move a notice of motion that we all go out for cookies, you're not going to be discussing it at that meeting.
No.
But then at the meeting two, that'll be on the agenda as, at the meeting one meeting, Councillor Smith moved the following notice of motion. And so at that point, until it's been
But
moved
we
and
would be
seconded.
talking about the motion, not
Yep.
the notice of motion.
Yes.
I just wanted to make that really clear in my mind. I don't know about anybody else's, but we don't debate or defend, or anything else, a notice of motion. That's pretty cut and dried. Only the motion.
So to go back to amendments, so yeah, the old bylaw, there was something which, to be honest, we didn't often enforce, but I did hated, so has been explicitly reversed. The old one said you could only amend something once. So that actually created a potential serious problem where somebody could do a very minor amendment, which was then wrecking any future potential changes. So it's now explicitly makes clear, and as a result of that, obviously, we typically entertained multiple amendments on items. This now makes explicitly clear that once something has been amended, it becomes the substantive motion, which itself can be amended. So you only get to the final vote on something when a majority in the chamber are clear that that is the motion you want to vote on. Moving on to voting rules. There are no abstentions in British Columbia. Something that we've mentioned a couple of times at council, particularly when members don't get their hands up in time during vote. Section 123(3) puts you in the hot seat. If you are present, you are required to vote. And if you, for whatever reason, try to avoid that by not voting, then the clerk of the meeting is required to record you as voting in favor of something unless you explicitly state your opposition. So if you want to oppose something, you have to make that absolutely crystal clear. If there is any doubt, then you risk being tagged as supporting something that you didn't like. Ties fail. That's a pretty standard, well, again, it's community charter requirement in section 123(5). So if, say, one of you is absent and there are only 6 of you in the room, then 3-3, that's failed to get a majority in favor, so the vote fails. Combining or dividing, did we wind up using the language of propositions? I know Mr. Smith didn't like that one. If there are multiple clauses in a proposal, then this gives you the ability to decide how it is you want to take those. So, for example, that council supports this motion and that council resolves to write to the minister about it. Is that one thing? Is it 2? You have the authority to take multiple votes on that if you wanted to, or you can roll it together into a single item if you want to. One thing where I think as staff we would strongly recommend you roll together into single votes is if there are financial implications for things. The absolute nightmare scenario for us is that you vote in favor of doing something and then vote against funding it. Which has us going, oh good grief, what do we do now? Which is also why, say, some of the recent grant applications where they've come to you as the council votes to support this and also to stand behind it financially should it be required. They've typically been taken as single votes because it would be extremely awkward if we were going to the ministry saying, so council want to do this. Yeah, if you don't give us the money, then we'll still be saying it's not our responsibility. So just...
What section is that?
F. Section 17F, Your Worship.
Thank you.
Change to proposal, not proposition. And so some of the changes that we made to committees, in addition to the, how they say, changed timeline requirements. It used to be the case that the committees would often be chaired by ordinary members of the public who were members of the committee. The problem with this, we found, was that if a committee was making a recommendation to council or was reporting back about something, then the chair of the committee is the logical person to introduce this, but they normally wouldn't be showing up. Well, I think in our dream scenario, the whole city would show up to council meetings because everyone would be that engaged and excited. Unfortunate reality is, a lot of the times people don't show up to council meetings. Approximately, 7,000 residents decide they don't want to, and only 20 decide they do. I'm on the side of the 20. So one of the changes that we made was to make the default that committees be chaired by elected members, since there's something of an expectation that you guys show up to these meetings. So the terms of reference can still make it permissible to not be chaired by elected members, but there's an expectation that you'll be the link. So you'll be explaining, say, if the committee has made a reference to another body or has made a recommendation to council, that the chair will be the person who explains and introduces all of that. Sections on membership. So yes, we included the new sections in F of both 48 and 49 on standing and select committees. The old rules didn't technically give any explanation as to how vacancies would be handled, but we had issues with, say, resignations from committees and also people who didn't show up, so they were no longer eligible to sit on committees. So this tries to make clear that new appointments will take place in accordance with the standard appointment procedure. As you know, recently, say, the airport committee had a couple of vacancies, and so I think that was pretty much the model that we'd hope to be doing going forwards, where there were new applicants who applied to the committee, were considered by the committee in closed session, and then it made a recommendation to council. So that meant that by the time it got to council, the subject matter experts had already had some degree of consideration. Although, as I was saying that, Councillor Christopherson turned his mic on, and as the chair of that committee, I hope he's not about to say it didn't work.
I just wanted to clarify that I believe there's no expectation that to fill a vacancy, you have to go back to the list of people who submitted their applications ahead of time.
No, Councillor, through your worship. If people apply for to be on a committee, then we do retain their application forms, but for a period of time. But just because you've applied at some point historically in the past does not mean that you'll be considered or automatically next in line for any vacancies that appear.
Good. Thank you.
And I think one of the other things we wanted to emphasize in this is the limited authority of select committees. The language comes from Community Charter. At least I think it certainly was meant to. That was to investigate matters, to inquire into matters, to report its findings and opinion to council. So the fundamental difference between select committees and standing committees is that standing committees can have authority delegated to them, and they have to be made up of at least half elected members, whereas select committees have far less requirement for elected members, and they are simply investigatory bodies that can make recommendations but not actually take action. And so there's an emphasis in the select committees must not commit the city to any course of action. So just it's the sort of thing which isn't strictly required because logically they can't based on the community charter, but a rule that again we wanted to have in there to make crystal clear, since the rules are not always crystal clear. And I think at that point I am out of slideshow, so are there any further questions, comments, or points?
No more riveting debate on procedures? Are we happy with what's in here? If not, please let Mr. Lois know, and if there's anything we've missed, bring it to our attention, and we'll have it corrected. At that point, I see no other debate or questions, so that is it for that. Thank you very much, Mr. Lois, and we are deemed